So in this course, we've talked a lot about species, and in this lesson, we're going to kind of talk about how do new species form, okay? And to go back to, there's a little activity I asked you to do, was that species is sort of like a gray area, okay? It's not as simple as black and white. You can sometimes have mixing of species, even though like the main definition we use in biology is that they can't breed naturally if they're two different species. There are sort of exceptions to that rule. So if you watch that little video that I linked, you will have seen some of that. So it's not exactly that they can breed or they cannot breed. Sometimes there is like little bits in between. So it does provide a little bit of a gray area. But what I want to talk about in here is sort of ways that new species can form. And we are going to kind of go along with the assumption that it is individuals that can breed naturally with each other, even though, as I said, that's not realistic in real life. That's sort of like the best definition that biologists have for species. So just to mention what microevolution is, you have micro and macro. The microevolution are very small scale changes, which eventually will cause unique species that are sort of similar to one another. So over here as an example, I have a common ancestor, and then I have genetic variation, which leads to all of these four unique species over a very long period of time. So these are like the very small changes that happen that are favored in each environment. And over time, those organisms become so different from one another that they can no longer interbreed. So we would call that speciation. We have actually formed a new species so different from one another that they cannot actually breed with each other. So again, going back to the definition that we are going to use in biology, these are individuals that can breed naturally with one another, and different species have separate gene pools. So I define right here for us what a gene pool is. This is all genes and alleles available for reproduction in a population. So if I was looking at like the population of Toronto, I'm referring to the species of humans there, and the gene pool in Toronto would be all of the people in there that have genes available to actually breed. If I was looking at a population of dogs that live in Mississauga, let's say, those dogs would represent the gene pool for that particular species. So again, they have to be able to interbreed with each other, which is why we're using the simple definition for species that I've just mentioned. So I want to talk about a few ways that speciation happens. For one, we have something called reproductive isolation. And these are essentially things that keep species from breeding with each other. So they keep them separate from one another. So these, I'll give you a few examples of, and you will see there's like a lot more examples than what I'm mentioning. I'm going to post a video that relates to this as well. But these are things that would keep different species from actually mating with one another. So first, we have behavioral isolation. They have different courtship behaviors. So they're not attracted to the other species because of just different behaviors that they have. Next is temporal isolation. They have different times of the year when they breed. So really good examples of this are plants. Certain plants will breed in different seasons. If it's not in the same season as another plant, it's not going to even attempt to reproduce with another. Ecological means that similar species will occupy slightly different habitats within the same area. And my little picture that I've drawn on the side is basically that geographically, let's say where there's a hill or a mountain, that is considered the same area, but you have very different conditions at the bottom and top of the mountain. And so just by sake of where those organisms are, they aren't going to interbreed, okay? Mechanical isolation is structural features that prevents mating. So the male and female genitalia don't actually are not actually compatible. They cannot actually breed with one another. And finally on this list, which is gametic isolation, these are just the gametes are not compatible. And we see this a lot in marine ecosystems as well, because oftentimes the gametes are just released into the water, but they aren't going to just randomly fertilize any other gamete that they find. Just physically, they are not compatible to do that. So all of these that I've listed, these 5, these are prezygotic. This is to prevent breeding and or fertilization from happening, okay? The second list that I give you down here is postzygotic. So imagining that these 2 organisms have overcome those issues that I've mentioned above, now it's why they can't form a species even though they might have actually fertilization of the zygote. So these are not viable, and so these offspring, for whatever reason, are not going to be able to reproduce. And so again, that means that they have formed separate species. So if they're not able to reproduce, these offspring are not considered to be a new species then. So, again, imagining all of those prezygotic mechanisms have been overcome, we have what's called zygotic mortality, which is that the zygote does not survive or grow. Okay, so that's the first one. Hybrid inviability means the hybrid or the offspring of those 2 separate species, it dies either before birth or before reproductive maturity. So even though the zygote can start to develop, it could actually be born, but it's not going to necessarily survive past that point long enough to actually reproduce. Hybrid infertility is that the offspring does reproduce, but unfortunately they are sterile. So mules, for example, are sterile offspring of horse and donkeys mating together. So again, horse and donkeys, they're sort of similar enough that they can overcome those prezygotic barriers, but their offspring, the mule, is not able to then reproduce naturally again. So we would consider those still 2 separate species. So again, the hybrid that I keep mentioning, this is the offspring of a cross between individuals that are separated species. So we have a couple of sort of other models of speciation. One is called allopatric, and the allo means of different areas. So I put a little picture on the side here. This is if you have like geographic isolation. So let's say that these trees, they were all in one single area at first. But suddenly over like many, actually not suddenly, but it could be over many, many years, there's an earthquake or something like that causes a fissure to form, a big gap between them. Well, over time, these trees are going to become different from each other. And so over many, many generations, they will become so different that they can no longer interbreed with each other. So imagine for just argument's sake, let's say one side of this river gets more water than the other side, right? Those trees are going to adapt to that condition versus the drier side are going to adapt to that condition. The other one is sympatric speciation. Sympatric means the same area. So evolution of the species within the same area. So again, thinking of like a smaller scale, like if we had a mountain area, top of the mountain versus bottom of the mountain and so forth, that's a very similar spot. But now they are actually adapting to utilize different things. So with my tree picture, I'm imagining that something in the very middle of this area, those trees are using differently, and so they are changing as opposed to the ones that are around it, which are sort of remaining the same. And over time, they become so different that actually they cannot interbreed anymore. So I mentioned it before, speciation is extremely slow, especially for organisms that are that have a really slow reproductive time. Okay, so such as the ones I've mentioned here. So the other one, which is really applying more to plants, is called polyploidy. So polyploidy in humans we know does not work because we are supposed to only have 2 N chromosomes. If for whatever reason we had 3 N chromosomes, that would not be viable, right? It would not actually grow into an embryo and a fetus. So in plants, it's actually advantageous to have more than 2 sets of chromosomes sometimes. So we have what are called polyploids, which means it has more than 2 sets of chromosomes in the adults. So what we see happening in genetic engineering a lot is that they're trying to manipulate fruits so that they have actually more than 2 N chromosomes. So these polyploids, let's say for here, a strawberry, this could be 4N, which is that has 4 sets of chromosomes. Now, the benefit of this is it produces really large fruit, but the problem is it cannot then breed with its parent anymore. It has to actually breed with other 4N individuals. So in that sense, we consider it almost like a new species. It cannot breed with its parents. It has to breed with one of its essentially siblings that has the same chromosome number as it.